Good morning. It's Saturday morning, and of course, it's time for a management review. Today, we will be talking about the MVP, or the minimum viable product, or more specifically about the myths that surround the minimum viable product. I will be talking about 7 specific myths that have kind of arisen around the MVP, misconceptions, if you will, that as a product leader you need to be aware of when you're building a software product. So I'll cover them in turn. So first, the first myth is about confusing minimalism with quality. So often many executives make the mistake of thinking that an MVP, a minimum viable product, is a slipshod product developed quickly and thrown over the board. It's error prone, it doesn't fully work, and they're okay with that. That's a mistake. One of the big problems you'll have with that, and it'll become immediately obvious, is that the product won't work for your target customers, and they won't use it. And you have, as a consequence, learned nothing about your product. You have proved no hypothesis other than the obvious one that a broken product won't sell. And that's not a useful insight. You didn't need to go to customers to go figure out that a broken product won't sell. If it did work for you, there's no chance that it would have worked for the customers. So don't make low quality products. Don't confuse minimalism with building a product that's buggy or incomplete, more importantly, and expect that you will learn anything useful from having developed that product. The second myth I want to address is about confusing customers' desires and needs, or desires more importantly, with what an MVP is. This is a problem that enterprise SaaS businesses are particularly prone to, particularly when one of the founders comes from a sales background. So what typically happens is that the founder will go out and meet a bunch of customers, typically people he would have interacted with while working for his past employer, and he'll get a bunch of feedback about he'll pitch the product, and he'll get a bunch of feedback about what those customers want in the product. And this is critical. You must do this as a startup founder. That is very important. You need to be doing it, even as a product leader as well. Even if you're not in a startup, you need to go talk to prospective customers. However, simply taking their needs or their stated needs or desires as the basis for the definition of your MVP or even a subset of those desires as a basis for a definition of your MVP is a huge mistake. And the reason is very simple. Your customers are essentially basing their opinions on what they might have seen in the market already. And while that's very useful, and you may in fact have some of those features in your MVP or in your ultimate product, this is not a definition of your MVP. When you do this, when you take your customers' needs unfiltered, customers' stated needs unfiltered, and make them into a product definition, you're relinquishing the job of product design to your customers. That is a cardinal sin. No customer would ever have invented the iPhone. That needed the genius of Apple and Steve Jobs to do it, and then show the product to the customers. You cannot define a new product by taking your customer's definition of what product they want. It's an important input, but don't confuse it with actually designing the product. And secondly, more importantly, should you do this and you take the customer's definition of what constitutes your product, you will essentially be building the product that your competitors already have in the market. And they've been building it for several years, if not decades, and you're setting yourself up for failure. So don't do that. Define your MVP from scratch. Don't take your customers' input literally. The third myth that I want to address falls on the opposite side of the spectrum from minimalism. Often executives confuse viability with visual polish. A visually polished, appealing looking app is considered more viable than one that is that's rough around the edges but functional. This is dangerous for a variety of reasons. First of all, you should understand that visual polish in a software application is essentially just a feature. It's a feature like any other feature, and you need to treat it as such. Determine whether the feature has value to the end customer, and if it does, by all means, go ahead and build out the feature. Get the visual polish, make it a highly polished app, and that will be a feature of your MVP. But don't do this without actually confirming that your customer actually needs high visual polish. It could be that you could give them a functional but not very appealing user interface. For example, perhaps in case of a DevOps product, give them a command line deployment tool, and they might be perfectly happy with it. They may not need a polished UI. And if that's the case, you've saved yourself a lot of time in proving the important hypothesis, which is whether your core product features are actually valuable. The next thing I want to talk about are confusing releases with launches. So there is this mantra in software engineering, which is to release early, release often. And this is a very good thing for software engineering. Don't get me wrong, you want to be doing that. However, don't confuse a release with a launch. A launch is more than just a shipping of code. It may be in some cases just shipping code, but most often it is much more than that. You'll have to do many things as part of a launch, and of a launch of an MVP in particular. You'll have to build up some demand. You'll have to maybe prep a sales pipeline. You might have to make sure that some customer support is there. None of this needs to be very complicated or very comprehensive. It can be very narrowly focused, but it must be thought through and prepared for before you launch your MVP. And the more dangerous thing about confusing releases with launches is that when you do this, your engineers and you yourself, if you are the developer, will start focusing on user visible features and shipping user visible features constantly. So initially that will be a good thing because you want to ship user visible features. But as the weeks progress and you're doing rapid iterations, you will find yourself shipping more and more minor features and not addressing critical problems. If one of the critical things you need to verify with your target market involves building something that requires relatively complex engineering that won't show to the customer, you will be doing yourself a disservice. So don't confuse code releases with launches. They are interrelated, but don't connect them in such a direct way. The next myth is confusing an MVP with minimal product planning effort. This is particularly a problem with product leaders that are used to giving direction, setting vision, and then say, "Oh, make it happen." So, sit back like Captain Picard on the deck of the Enterprise and say, "Make it so." And then expect your developers to come up with a series of prototypes that will become the MVP. And when they don't, you fire them or do something stupid like that. So that's a mistake. As a product leader, whether you're the founder or a product manager within the company, whoever you are, whatever your role is, it is your job to define the MVP, and that is hard work. It means talking to customers, it means researching features, researching competition, defining customer profiles, defining feature sets, doing all the hard work that goes into defining an MVP. It is often more hard work for the product leader to develop the MVP feature set than it is for them not to do an MVP and just get started. And so there's a strong tendency to not do it and throw the work over to the developers. Development is always more expensive than product research and product planning. So don't skimp on product planning just because you're building an MVP. Plan aggressively, even more so when you're aiming for an MVP. The next thing is about confusing the famous skateboard analogy. So there's this analogy in product management circles about MVPs, where instead of building, when you want to build a car, you first start off with building a skateboard, and then you build a bicycle, and then you ultimately get to your car. The point being that your customers' need is a transportation need. First, build the simplest product that solved their transportation need. That is a good analogy, and it specifically addresses the incompleteness problem I dealt with earlier when you're confusing minimalism with quality. Don't build an incomplete or an error-prone product. However, it creates another problem that's a little more pernicious. The belief that somehow you have to build an unrelated product in order to get to the product you're going to get to. That's not the case. What the analogy should actually be taken to mean is that first, build a competence in an area you hypothesize is important. For example, to take the example of Tesla, Tesla didn't start off as a skateboard company. It's a car company, but Musk didn't start off by building skateboards. He started X.com, and then which eventually became PayPal, and then started Tesla and SpaceX. The takeaway from this broadly is that essentially it would seem that what Tesla's most critical ingredient was financing. Building a car company takes a lot of money, and by the time Musk came to Tesla, he had already developed a track record of having created successful exits with his investors, with X.com and PayPal and others, and so he had a reputation for being a good investment, and that made it easy for him to raise the large amounts of money needed to fund Tesla. So the critical capability in that case was financing, and he developed that financing skill in other companies. So think about it that way. Think about validating a specific capability that you want your company or your product to have in order to serve your target market, rather than thinking of your MVP as being just in terms of serving a customer need. It can be some capability, not necessarily a customer need. It might be that, and you might go ahead and go build that skateboard company, but don't take the analogy too literally. The final myth I want to talk about is thinking about the MVP as a single milestone. It isn't a single milestone. The MVP, you will have several MVPs during the life of your product. Each MVP is the culmination of a series of experiments, the early ones having failed, and the final MVP experiment having succeeded. And to verify that a given feature is needed by a target customer or class of customers, and then you repeat the process again with a larger customer set or a different customer set, and verify another feature or hypothesis about your product. And this process is continuous. So there is no big moment where you've reached your MVP, and more importantly, you can't know at the time you're creating your MVP that you've actually developed it. You can only know in hindsight that what you developed was an MVP by seeing it succeed and see traction, and it gets traction in the market. So you only know your MVP by looking at it in the rearview mirror. And that's it for today. Happy coding!